much, the three of you, for the fantastic presentations. We'll have questions now. I will take slight advantage of my chairing role, and I will ask the first question to Pablo. Pablo, I'm very curious, so I'd like to ask you to clarify, if possible, what you mean in your definition of decarbonization, your DC category, because I can see that the main emissions are out of that. So if you can clarify, that would be great. And I'll open the floor to questions. Please be as brief as possible because we are late in our schedule. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a truly excellent panel. Thank you so much. Pablo, did I get the main point correctly, that basically the development bank's green finance is the same as the regular finance? That they're not doing anything different when they call it green, just to make sure I understood the point. Yeah, Farwa, very interesting presentation. So a couple of things, this Djibouti example that you gave, how did these investors make so much money? What was going on? What is the process whereby the green bond generates these massive profits in just a very short period? And just broadly, it also seems to me that a critical thing that underlies all of you, that we don't still have a decent definition of what climate finance is. So, fine.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I have just a few comments on Adrina and Farwa. The first one regarding the Belize, that's what is when one looks in detail into this financial instrument, it's amazing how complicated it is for such a small economy. And actually what's presented as something that reduces debt and improves the environment, it's actually one realizes that these countries are just trapped into a very stringent financial environment. For example, in the case of Belize, Swiss Bank had to offer an enticement worth $18 million for private sector for the private sector to accept private sector investors to buy the bonds. Then they charge a differential rate of interest between what Belize had to pay, which was about 6%, and what they charge the investors at 3%. And over time, this increased. The International Development Financial Corporation of the US had to provide collateral, 100%, and there was no information regarding the conditionalities that Farwa referred to. Then there were insurance clauses, and the insurance clauses were drafted by an insurance company linked to vulture funds. And the commitments that Belize made, which were not made transparent, came with stringent penalties. Local communities were not also involved, and they should have been involved. I think that's one of the recommendations what should make. And this can be not only an instrument where you do not have a very big reduction in debt. You mentioned 12%, IMF has 8.7%, Barbados 0.1% of GDP, Ecuador 0.8%. But they come probably with a commitment by the Belizean authority to allow private companies to exploit the environment. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I'm Pau. I'm currently a consultant at the World Bank, and I have a question to Farwa and Pablo, because you both mentioned blended finance, and I was just wondering whether you could confirm. My impression is that within that mobilization ratio that is often given, the majority of that money mobilized often comes from other public sources, and only a small part is actually private. So could you just confirm whether my impression or reading of what there is correct, and whether you see it the same way, and if so, how you explain that it's still the story is still told in that way? Is it just a way of making the numbers appear in a much better light, or is there any other logic to that inefficiency of blended finance? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great panel. A quick addition to what Esteban said for Adrina's presentation on debt for nature swaps. I think it is more problematic than just scaling it up. First of all, it's really important to make sure that their second best ways to do project finance for countries with liquidity problems and fiscal lack of fiscal space, but with dealing with solvency, like solving that gets really dangerous. One of the reasons is that there's never been one with multiple creditors, and as we know, the creditor composition of every country in debt distress now is so diverse, and so you might cut a deal with one, but it would leak out to the other. The way to secure that would be to put it in a trust, but that becomes a legal problem because then you'd be treating it as senior, and that's just then you're in big trouble. And in the form of if they're in the form of buybacks, Moody's sees those as defaults. So they're you can be careful of what instrument for what problem. We sort of feel like it's a second best way to do project finance for countries with liquidity problems and not much fiscal space, but really careful not to mix that as a solution to the debt crisis, even if it could be done by scale.
Great panel. My question is for all of you and also to everyone in the room. So what puzzles me a lot is that the climate crisis and the need to mobilization is in our face, right? But even with this, we are not seeing as a war financing approach, right? We need to fast disbursement and development and try to do as much as we can to avoid the cost of inaction. I wonder why we are not having a more pragmatic approach to this. As Deng Xiaoping used to say, right? Doesn't matter the color of the cat, it has to chase the rat. Doesn't matter if it's public investment, if it's private, if it's local, international. We need to mobilize and actually should be all together in the same direction. So what is preventing us to have a more pragmatic approach? Is it ideology that makes us think that the only capital that is worth is the private? Is it a gatekeeping? Is developed countries trying to protect their own company? So what is happening that doesn't allow us to play a pragmatic role to this problem? Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose to Farwa and also perhaps to Pablo, but we did have at a certain point of time in countries which basically decided to adopt mixed economy strategies. That you were not socialist countries, you didn't have central planning, but you had a state which wanted to intervene in the development process. And one of the things states of that kind did was to try and devise ways in which they could, in some sense, push, nudge, whatever it is, the private sector to do certain things, subject to certain prerequisites and subject to a certain kind of regulation in terms of monitoring and ensuring outcomes of the kind that you wanted. Now, so when we are dealing with all this debate about blended finance and all, it's true that it came from a completely different side. But are we going to think of an alternative way of trying to say that, listen, we think that states can actually use resources to try and move private investment, which is quite large, in particular directions, subject to the following guidelines being met and the following monitoring and regulatory apparatus being put in place. I mean, should we be more proactive in not leaving the idea of the private sector having to play a role only to private players determining the conditions, of where the state itself begins to determine the conditions?
Back, Karina there. Last one.
Hi, thank you so much. This panel is really amazing. I have many questions, but I think I'll only ask one. I was thinking about the kind of the broader implications in terms of the role of MDBs in the international financial architecture as we move towards those blended finance arrangements where de-risking means taking, of course, being ultimately liable, right, for if there are events of default, and what that means for their role as lenders of last resort and also preferred creditors.
Start? Pablo, maybe?
Let me go as fast as I can. Decarbonization, it includes, these are projects that talk about lowering emissions but do not specify a lot what the technologies are. Because there is a lot of fusedness and vagueness in the project. The classification was not that easy. The difference between green and other finance, what I'm saying is they moved, the orientation of a multilateral development credit towards green or climate finance is not as stark as one could expect. I'm going to I'm being a bit polite. Yes. 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 I'm being recorded, so I better take care of. Yes. Decent definition of what climate finance is? No, we don't have one. Furthermore, there is not even an agreed definition of what energy transition is. The underlying concept that should apply to climate finance is not there. Whether it includes it only includes supply factors, demand factors, the causality. There is not an agreed definition. Whether mobilizing also includes mainly public funds. I don't have confirmation. The data does not say so. Is not at least what we have seen, and also the project, the reports of World Bank and IDB does not state what is the origin of the mobilized funds. Last year report of the IFC does not state the origin. One can suspect, yes, there might be a pool of public and private funds. So my reply would be, I can't confirm it because there is no statement at all. Why not a pragmatic approach? Why not? Why hasn't there been one? Is because, in my view, there are factors of ideology. I mean, not on future government, very likely governments in the near future. But one point is that there is no individual recognition of climate change as a global challenge. I will put it that way. There is a lot of the Paris Agreement has this principle, which in principle is fine, and I stand by it, which is that one of common but differentiated responsibilities regarding. So there are rich which have more, but they still don't. There is no, in economic jargon, no internalization of that principle. Let's put it that way, in my view. It's very much looking at one own country, and if I'm in a dispute with China, then that's the main objective, the dispute itself, rather than sharing technologies or whatever. So I think there is too much a nationalistic outlook. That's why, in my view, more of a pragmatic approach. The other question was more role for the state. And yes, well, I'm a post-Keynesian, right? And there comes into mind the socialization of investment approach by Keynes. Like the state sets what the goals are, what the rhythm should be, and it employs different arrangements, some of which we may agree, some of which we may not, according to these priorities. And if the state needs to be the one that invests, that puts the money, so be it. I'm a fanatical defender of fundamentalist of public investment. So it's one has the guy to turn back to. I mean, let's bring back Keynes. Simple. That's my reply to that point.
I'll be very brief. Thank you, Esteban, for adding so much more context to the Belize swap case, particularly for highlighting the role of credit insurance being provided and how stringent penalties on the country may further actually worsen the debt responsibilities the country has. So yeah, I do agree. It is much more nuanced and much more complicated than what it is made out to be in most cases. And to move on to Kevin's comment about it being more problematic than mere scaling up, I couldn't agree more. It is. And in terms of actually making it a viable alternative, there are obviously a lot more factors that come into play, especially something I wanted to mention during the presentation was the aspect of additionality, particularly for expenditure on conservation efforts. So at the country level, these swaps could potentially replace other conservation-focused interventions and may not be considered as extra measures. So when these countries are faced with stringent penalties, these externally mandated payment schedules for counterpart funds, the government might opt to reduce its own efforts and cut their already projected budget allocations for conservation spending accordingly. So there's also that. There's also the case of there being already a limited fiscal space for these countries. So yeah, it's not just scaling up, but a lot more nuance has to be there when we're considering this as an actual viable alternative. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. To Jayati's question on Djibouti and the Dutch fund, actually the problem was the reporting was in Dutch. So I think it's now available in English, but they have a very good graph of how the profits have been extracted. But I think the interesting thing about this reporting is also that these funds, more and more of these funds are now investing in countries where nobody else wants to invest. So this is a new development because I think if you think about investments in a country like Djibouti, you wouldn't find a very big record of investors. However, the trend is moving towards now investing in these very risky countries. Yeah, it's I mean, the model is on blended finance, building this windmill or whatever in terms of green energy or projects, but also it's donor funded as well because it's donor money is coming from the EU, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and from the Dutch DFI. So it's a combination, and so much and so forth that the CEO of the fund had to publicly say that the bonuses are not donor money. And then, of course, we'll have to see where the money is coming from. The second point on climate finance, yes, absolutely. There is no definition of climate finance. But this is not really well received by activists or people working on climate finance because they're keen to focus on a definition of climate finance. But I think we have to go back to what is then development finance and then what is climate finance. Where do they where do they differ and where do they meet, and what are we trying to achieve with this money? Because I think there's a lot of obsession with numbers, right? This money for adaptation, this for mitigation, and this for climate technologies and so on. So I think there has to be a consensus on how to move forward, combining these two financing streams. Then there was this question on mobilization ratios for blended finance. And actually, I agree with Pablo that it's not reported, but we have to also keep in mind what is a mobilization ratio, right? Because that's also a very problematic concept. So if you're bringing in $1 for $1 of public money, we were saying you're bringing in $1 of private finance, but actually doesn't materialize in the end because of whatever reasons, then the mobilization ratio becomes quite redundant as well. ODI has done some interesting work on that if you want to look at that. Also coming back to this question of what can be done and this idea of mixed economies. I mean, yes, if the private sector delivers, then we don't have a problem, right? I mean, we have achieved the green transition and so on, and the problem is solved. But we are living in an era of monopoly capital, and then to consider this notion of going back to some sort of developmental state would mean surpassing the whole era of monopoly capital, financialization, sticks and carrots for the private sector to then deliver. And once again, it's a very political issue as opposed to simply having those checks and balances. Because I know a lot of countries would like to have that kind of model, but I think the train has passed for a lot of reasons on that front. And what's encouraging is, I think, taking periods of time when global South states were actively working on their own on their own development banks, own regional banks to deliver for COVID. Isabel's presentation yesterday was really encouraging when she was referring to remunicipalization or the renationalization of certain sectors. And I mean, there is a drive to go back to these, right? I mean, Aruz's presentation was simply saying there is money and we can achieve it. And it can be done. So I think to me, it seems the emphasis then has to be on how to reverse the sort of conversations that we're having about the financing gap and just focusing on redistribution and not obsessing about this 2.3 trillion numbers, because honestly, this number is only going to grow, right? We're not going to say, oh, the number has reduced. So yeah, I think it's a matter of paying attention to what's there. I think I've answered all the questions.
Thank you very much. Just before I close this great panel, I just wanted to add something here with my IPCC hat. I was a chapter scientist at the IPCC for the last assessment report, AR6. And although the glossary is not the sexy part of any report, we have a glossary at the IPCC, and we put a lot of time and effort into the definitions. So there are some definitions. There are IPCC definitions of climate finance, of energy transition, of transition pathways. They're not the best, but I'm also an economist, so I feel that I have this role of connecting the climate world with the economics world. So please have a look at the glossary of the IPCC. And then we can discuss the definitions better. Thank you so much.